One to this webinar come workshop, which will be exploring ways of preventing a deprivation of liberty. My name is Toby Williamson. I'm chairing and helping to facilitate this afternoon. The event is led by the National Care Forum as a partner in the Care Provider Alliance and funded by Skills for Care. And it's part of a series of 3 webinars which have been revisiting the Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards, or DoLS, as most of you I'm sure know them, in the context of the Mental Capacity Act, human rights, and the indefinite postponement of the liberty protection safeguards that were intended to replace DoLS. As I say, I'll be chairing this afternoon's event, but together with Liz Jones, who's Policy Director at the National Care Forum, I'm just going to hand over to now to say some words of welcome from the National Care Forum. Over to you, Liz.
Thanks, Toby, and thank you for the intro. Yeah, welcome everybody. We're really delighted that you've had time to join us today. So I'm Liz Jones. I'm the Policy Director at the National Care Forum. I guess just to add to Toby's background on why we're running this webinar programme, we thought that things had gone very quiet really across the sector in terms of trying to support all of us in our best practice around deprivation of liberty safeguards, after we'd spent so much time and energy trying to get ready for the potential introduction of the liberty protection safeguards. So there was this huge amount of activity and lots of work happened to try and get ready for that new legislation. And then it all came to a pretty abrupt pause. And we thought actually that it's still a very important issue. We do hear quite regularly from members and from the regulator that our practice around deprivation of liberty safeguards is really, really important still. And there are lots of things that are really important, but this is one of them. And so we thought it'd be really helpful to run this series of webinars, bringing kind of different perspectives and helping us to think about, in this particular one, what can we do as care and support providers to find ways to prevent having to look for a deprivation of liberty, notwithstanding all the kind of process and procedure challenges that we know are out there, but how can we share learning, knowledge, best practice, and all the work actually that went on around thinking about the new legislation? What can we take from that, and what can we take from experience across the sector to just help us think about this again, because it's such a major implication for the people we support, as well as for how our staff work. So thank you for joining us, and great to see you.
Great, thanks, Liz. I'll just say a couple of words about myself. Those of you who were at the first webinar will already have heard this, but just to say, I'm an independent health and social care consultant. My background many years ago was working in and managing community and residential services for people with serious mental health problems, although that was well before the Mental Capacity Act came into effect. And then I subsequently worked at the Mental Health Foundation, a UK social research and development charity, where I led its policy work and work on dementia and mental health in later life. And whilst I was there, I co-chaired something called the Making Decisions Alliance, which campaigned successfully for the introduction of the Mental Capacity Act. And I subsequently was involved in a number of pieces of research and practice development around mental capacity issues. So it's a subject that is very close to my heart, and I've got a little bit of knowledge about, I think. So as I said at the beginning, this is the second of 3 webinars. The first one took place last month. I'm sure many of you were there, and it gave an overview really of the current situation with deprivation of liberty safeguards, as I say, in the context of the Mental Capacity Act, human rights, and some of the work that have been done in preparation for liberty protection safeguards being introduced, but of course they've been postponed. So this, as Liz has just said, this webinar, we really want to explore ways that can support you and your practice to think about how deprivations of liberty, a DoL as opposed to a DoLS, can be avoided or prevented. And we should always remind ourselves that deprivations of liberty are not simply a bureaucratic issue and a process. Deprivation of liberty is a violation of someone's human rights. So we should always have that in mind when we're thinking about DoLS and deprivations, restraints and restrictions. If you want to watch the first webinar, it's the slides and the speakers are available on the Care Provider Alliance website, which will flash that URL up at the end. And I'd encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to sign up for the third webinar, which is on the 5th of December, which will look in depth at current DoLS processes, especially applications and authorizations, and how these could be made to work as well as possible for providers. Excuse me. So this is an interactive workshop today. So we have a panel of experts who will speak briefly at the beginning of the webinar, but then we really want to hand it over to you to get your questions and thoughts about the issues we're talking about today. We've got expertise and experience from a local authority perspective, from learning disability, autism and dementia perspectives, as well as Mental Capacity Act advocacy. And I'll introduce them shortly. But as I say, please do ask questions. We've also got some questions that have been posed in advance. So we will want to spend the majority of the webinar really exploring the particular issues that you have from your services and from your practice. So just a couple of housekeeping points before we really get going. If you do want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the top of your screen, and Liz will be monitoring and moderating that. And if you see a question, or if you think of asking a question, but see a question that's similar to the one that you were going to ask, you could like the question that's already been posed rather than adding another one. And the number of likes shows us that that's a particular topic or issue that colleagues and attendees want to hear more about. So we would encourage you to include your name if you want to, but if you don't, that's fair enough. You can post anonymously. And you can turn on live captioning by selecting captions and subtitles, which I think are somewhere on the menu. I think in the extended menu on the controls. We are recording the event, so a recording of the event with slides and links and resources, etc., will be on the Care Provider Alliance website after the webinar's finished. And we're also using social media during the event. So if you want to tweet, retweet, or use social media in any other way to tell people about the event, please do so. So I think we can get going. So we've got a series of speakers who are just going to speak for a few minutes to introduce themselves, starting with Lorraine Curry, who's the independent mental capacity consultant. She'll be followed by Michelle Oxley and Neil Salmon. I'm hoping that Neil has been able to join us. I think he's with us now, who are independent Mental Capacity Act advocates. They'll be followed by Caroline Clifton, who's an admiral nurse who works for Belong, a provider of services to people with dementia. And then we'll finish up with Rod Landman, who's project director and trainer at the Association for Real Change England, a membership organisation for providers of services to people with learning disabilities and autistic people. So without any more to do, I'm going to hand over to Lorraine, and thank you, Lorraine. I look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thanks. I'm just going to try and share. Yeah, okay. I think I need to bring myself over there, do I? Yay. Okay, so hi, welcome everybody. So my name's Lorraine Curry. I'm a social worker by background. I worked in learning disability team and then an older person's team before moving into Mental Capacity Act work, which is what I've done for the last however many years. So currently I do some work for West Midlands ADAS, which focuses on DoLS and the MCA. I'm almost hoarse because I've got a cough, and I spent all yesterday training and have been at a conference this morning. So I've got 10 minutes, which is great. And at the same time, it's an almost impossible task. So I'm trying to talk about avoiding a deprivation of liberty in 10 minutes. So just a reminder, really, a little bit of a reminder of what we did last time. So last time we sort of went right back into the Mental Capacity Act, and we looked at the fact that general care and treatment is part of what we do, where people can't consent to the care and treatment that they need, but we deliver that in their best interests. And the Mental Capacity Act protects us from liability, but it also ensures that people do in that way get the care and treatment that they need. And sometimes that involves some restrictions. Sometimes restrictions are just about the general running of a care home setting, and general things that we all do. We can't go into a room if it says staff only and things like that. You know, there are restrictions that we all face in our daily life that are just general restrictions and part of how society runs. And the Mental Capacity Act is no different. And then we move on through that, through the Act, and we move into, well, what about if we need to restrain someone? And the Mental Capacity Act accepts that sometimes restraint will be necessary, but it requires a little bit more from us than just a reasonable belief the person lacks capacity, a reasonable belief that the thing we need to do is in their best interest. Where restraint is involved, it says that must be necessary to prevent harm to the person and proportionate to the likelihood and the seriousness of that harm. And that is within the MCA itself, so that we're protected from liability where we need to use some form of restraint to deliver care, and where we evidence that it is necessary and proportionate to the likelihood and seriousness of harm. So we're staying within the MCA just in general at this point for the first three blocks there. And then we move into the area where we have imposed so many restrictions and restraint that the person is deprived of liberty. And at that point, we then have additional requirements to authorise that by the use of either Schedule A1 of the MCA, which is the thing we know and love as DoLS, or for some people outside of care homes and hospitals, that is a court order. But the important thing is to remember that there is a continuum of care, restriction, restraint, and deprivation. So it's really important that we understand the difference between restricting a person's liberty and depriving them of liberty, because there's an important legal difference. The difference between a deprivation of liberty and restrictions upon liberty really are just about the degree and intensity of what we do, and not the nature and substance of the thing itself. So in the early days, you know, endless phone calls about locked doors. Is it a deprivation of liberty? Well, not on its own, it isn't, because we all lock our doors at night. We all live in a house where we feel safer if the door's locked. But generally, the people who live with us know that the door's locked, how to open the door, where the key is kept, and so on. So it's not necessarily the thing itself. It's not the lap belt in a wheelchair. It's how often that lap belt is used, in what situations, for how long, and to what intensity. It is also important to look at how a series of restrictions can band together, if you like, so that the cumulative effect is a deprivation of liberty based on the acid test that we talked about last time. And sometimes it's challenging to work out which side of the line something is, but in order to make sure that we have the necessary legal protection and the person has the necessary legal protection, we do have to decide which side of the line we're on. And the final box there is a link, in case it wasn't on last time, to some work by the Law Society, which helps us to kind of it helps by explaining lots of different situations in care homes, hospitals, a person's own home, younger people, under 18s and so on. And it will give you some kind of scenarios that will say, this is most likely a deprivation of liberty, or this is perhaps not a deprivation of liberty. So I do recommend it to you. In arriving at our decision about which side of the line it's on, we must remember the warning that Lady Hale gave in Cheshire West, that we should err on the side of caution in deciding what constitutes a deprivation of liberty, because of what she saw as the extreme vulnerabilities of people in question. She did go on to say that they needed a sort of annual check, and didn't really describe it as something as complex as the Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards have come to be. And we also know that human rights requires us to evidence necessity to prevent harm and proportionality based on the likelihood and seriousness of harm, because we are interfering with someone's human rights, and that's because a deprivation of liberty is a breach of Article 5, unless we're evidencing why it's necessary and why it's proportionate. So how on earth will we ever avoid a deprivation of liberty? And I'm just going to throw a number of very, very big things here, and each one of them, you know, is a session in its own right. Importantly, first thing I would point to is supported decision making. The time, effort that we invest in supporting people to make their own decisions pays off down the line, because then we don't find a lack of capacity and we don't engage in the rest of what we're talking about here today. We don't engage in those things because people have capacity to make their own decisions, and where that might involve an odd restriction, then people can consent to that with capacity. Supported decision making in all its many, many forms, really, really important. Secondly, is considering all the time less restrictive practice. This is what I'm doing. How can I reduce those restrictions and actually achieve the same thing? Do I really need to be doing it in this way? Based on that, keeping care plans regularly under review. Just because someone needed something a year ago, do they still need it? Is that restriction still relevant? Is the risk of harm still what it was? Is the risk of harm, in fact, still even there? And making those risk assessments robust, ever-changing, evolving, changing as the person changes, and always being willing to go back, reduce the risk, remove the restriction. And regularly, in the same way, revisiting mental capacity. It's not a once and for all opportunity to have capacity or to not have capacity. People can grow and change and develop, and with good supported decision making, we can move people to a place where they do have capacity for their own individual decisions, and then we'll start that process again, support them with different decisions, look at less restrictive ways of delivering care, and so on, following that round. And then a tool that I wrote a few years ago, and it's just recently been updated because none of us had noticed that a page had gone missing in between. So it went from point 6 to point 8, and we'd lost 7. So it's recently been updated. In updating it, it's no longer a PDF, which I think is unfortunate because I quite like the PDF, and other people did, to print off. But this is a tool that talks about how to look at reducing your restrictions. It looks at direct restrictions. Is a person prevented from leaving? But it looks at indirect restrictions. Maybe they can come and go, but they need to ask permission, or they need to wait for staff to be available. And then it gives you some changes to consider in helping you to look at ways of reducing restrictions, taking us round that pathway that I just highlighted of supporting decision making, reducing restrictions. So I've put the link there. As I say, it's now just an online tool. It's not quite the same as a PDF. Oops. So that would appear to be it. I think I've managed to do that in 9 minutes, possibly. But the link will be there for you in the slides when you get it to that. And obviously, I'll be happy to answer any questions when we move on to the questions bit. So I'll stop sharing, ready for the next person, and I'll move.
That's great. Thank you, Lorraine. Very nice and very concise introduction to what we're talking about today, and I'd really recommend that tool, the resource that Lorraine just put up on the screen there, the Local Government Association resource, is a really valuable practical tool to look at. Right, I'm going to move us along, and I'm now going to introduce Michelle Oxley and Neil Salmon, who are IMCAs, and they have their 10 minutes, 5 minutes each. I know it's a challenge, but I'm sure you're up to it. Over to Michelle and Neil.
Thanks, Toby. Afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Oxley, and I'll start by letting you know a little bit about my background. So previous to advocacy, my background was in the education sector. I initially trained as a nursery nurse and worked specifically in one-to-one SEN support within mainstream primary schools. After a number of years doing that, I moved on to training as a teacher and worked in primary education, specialising in early years. So although completely different to this, I did feel that I advocated for some of the youngest and most vulnerable children in our education system. And around 6 years ago, I decided that the advocacy side was something I wanted to pursue, and made a huge career shift. And that brought me to working for Voiceability. And for the past 5 years, I've worked as an advocate, specifically covering the independent mental capacity advocacy, relevant persons representative, litigation friend, and 1.2 representative. And just to note that I'm really pleased that I made the shift. So the independent mental capacity advocate, or IMCA, the role can vary greatly from case to case, and that's due to individual needs of those that we support. There's a number of roles that we undertake within the umbrella of IMCA, and each of these comes with a specific set of rights and responsibilities. But within every IMCA case, we ensure that the person is kept at the centre of the process, and the outcome should be the least restrictive option that is possible for the person while still keeping them safe. The IMCA role provides the person who lacks capacity with a safeguard, and that's their right to have. So a failure to instruct an IMCA could deny them of their rights. Essentially, the IMCA is there to provide support to and to represent the person within the decision-making process. And an IMCA would be looking to ensure the Mental Capacity Act is being followed with regards to this. And we ensure that a person's voice is heard and that their views and wishes are considered. And at this point, I'm going to pass on to my colleague, Neil.
Hi there, everybody, and thanks very much, Michelle. I've been an advocate for quite a long time now, since about 2006, following a bit of a mental health episode, lived experience thing that happened in my life that changed the direction, really. I had been working in the NHS and had to kind of restart again and find my feet. And one of the things I did was do some voluntary work in various charity shops and things, and saw an advert for a volunteer advocate. So I signed up and had a go. And from that moment onwards, I kind of discovered this was something that I could pretty well do. it was certainly interesting, and every single case was different. And back in 2006, just before the sort of Mental Capacity Act came out, the world of advocacy was very different. It was almost all things to all people, rather than the very narrow statutory defined criteria that we have to work to within these days. But I'm very, very glad that we do, because the safeguards really are out there for people. And as we know, the Deprivation of Liberty Safeguard itself is there to really be a legal safeguard when somebody has to be deprived of their liberty for their own good, really, and for what is described as their best interests. So we're talking about this today, but what I'm going to tell you about in the last 5 minutes of this introduction is what we're really about at advocacy, because it may get missed. Advocacy is very much about empowering individuals to speak up for themselves, to have a voice themselves. I always let people know about this by reminding them of the situation I was in a meeting when I was with a client. They were in the meeting speaking up. At the end of the meeting, the social worker said to me, well, you didn't say anything, did you? What was your role? And I said, did you not hear what the person was saying? We spent several weeks trying to get to this point to support this chap to speak up. And suddenly the social worker got it. You know, it was about empowering that person to have a voice. We can't always do that with people who are struggling so much with their mental health, their mental capacity, with cognitive functioning and so on, but we do our very best to include them. And all of those principles of the Mental Capacity Act, I hope you've heard about, you know, particularly about involving people in decision making, and you know, all of that stuff is really important. If some individual that we're talking about, and in the courtroom, they're known as P for some reason, but they are a person, a real person, and a real individual with a life history. And we get to know about that, and we get to help that person speak up. So that's one of the things, empowerment. Independence, we are not social workers, local authority, mental health workers, or, you know, anything else. We come in as purely on the person's side of the fence. And we're there with no judgment, with no sort of agenda. We're there to listen and find out what their wishes and feelings are, or would be if they had the capacity. And sometimes as because we have to trail back through history and speak to people that can help enlighten us about somebody's wishes and feelings. I call it research, and I think it's valid, and it's very important to know the person as best you can if you're going to support them. So we try very hard, and when people are deprived of their liberty, often they don't like it. So the rights under the Mental Capacity Act and the Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards luckily gives them the right to appeal. So we can support them in that process and help find them a solicitor, help act in their shoes, really, as a litigation friend. Not every local authority commissions advocates to do litigation friend work, but we're lucky in Sunderland, where Michelle and myself work, to have the opportunity to take on that role as well. So this is a role where you're helping fight the case for somebody in court. You are directing proceedings. You build a legal team for your client on the basis of what they wish and they want. And you get the advice from the legal team, the solicitor, and in court, you will get a barrister as well. So you're basically instructing them on the basis of what that person's wishes and feelings are and what they want and their appeal against the DoLS. So some days we do win those cases. Often they're won before we even get to court. And one of the areas we win sometimes is around capacity, because a capacity assessment done badly is a very bad capacity assessment in my book. And we have found that often people have had a reassessment of their capacity under the threat of court for the local authority, and it's been overturned, or we found a less restrictive option for that person. So what was proposed in the first place was no longer in their best interests. So we've been able to fight on either ground, the capacity or the best interest one. Trying to prevent deprivations of liberty is quite difficult for advocates, because we normally get involved as soon as somebody's deprived, or as an IMCA involved in the process of the assessment of that deprivation. We don't get to meet the client before that day, usually. So it's very unlikely that we can proactively help individuals to avoid deprivation of liberty, but we can help them get out of it. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear. Any advice we give you about preventing deprivation of liberty safeguards is going to be a bit outside of our real area of knowledge, but we do know quite a bit, so we'll do our best. So that's me. Thanks very much for listening. I'll be here for questions later. I'm going to hand over to the next person, but I'm not sure who that is.
That's great. Thanks, Neil. Yeah, I mean, that was great. Thank you, Michelle, as well, for that kind of very brief, but again, very concise overview of the role of IMCAs and advocacy. And I think echoing the point that Lorraine made about the role that you can play in terms of empowering and supporting people to make decisions, but also support good decision making if it's a best interest decision, and how that can play into thinking hard about, well, is a deprivation really needed? Is that in their best interest, or are there other ways in which we can find out about the person and think about the kind of care and the arrangements of care that need putting in place? So I'm sure you've got lots to offer in terms of today's topic. But I'll move us on, because I'm aware time is moving on. And our next speaker is Caroline Clifton, who's an Admiral nurse, a specialist dementia nurse for Belong, which is a provider of services for older people and people with dementia. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Toby, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me today, really. So I probably should start with what is an Admiral nurse. And I don't want to insult anybody, but it's still, a lot of people still don't know what an Admiral nurse is and does. So my role in Belong is in partnership with a charity called Dementia UK. And it's a charity that specialises in dementia, and it hosts Admiral nurses in all sorts of areas. So it could be care settings, it could be hospices, it could be hospitals, and the main role of Admiral nurse is specialist assessment, really, of people living with dementia and complex needs. We offer emotional support, dementia specific training and education, and we also offer community work, and that can be with anybody. That can be with health and social care professionals, or for myself, it's in my own organisation. And the overall aim of an Admiral nurse is to support and empower people living with dementia and their families, but also the employees of Belong as well. So that's me in a nutshell. And I guess the deprivation of liberty, my experience is mainly in Belong. But I know that obviously it's essential for safeguarding the rights and well-being of dementia. My observations of DoLS and sort of preventing restrictions would be based on individualised care, that person-centred care, developing personalised care plans, respecting a resident's autonomy and preferences, their choices, their wishes. Just by doing so, you can significantly reduce the need for restrictive measures. trying to engage residents and the families in the planning process, give that person a sense of control and ownership over their own life. Another important thing for me would be clear record keeping, you know, document the DoLS process as you're going along. So from your initial referral, DoLS assessment, right the way through to any actions that have to be taken. So things like the reason for the DoLS, you know, document why you think a DoLS is required, why have you made the referral in the first place? And it could be, you know, to prevent harm to the person, it could be to manage risks, but also make sure you're documenting your capacity assessments, your best interests, decisions, record the outcome of the DoLS. You know, sometimes there are conditions based on a DoLS. Record if it was even approved. Sometimes people are seen by the DoLS assessors and the application isn't approved. Another important aspect for me would be regularly reviewing and monitoring. So have a system for regularly assessing and reviewing residents, you know, the care that they're receiving, their living arrangements, the effectiveness of any care strategies that you've got in place, and just to ensure that any restrictive measures are still justified and minimised. So if you set goals for a person, for example, just make sure that they're measurable and achievable. So it could be that you're setting a measure for the reduction, I don't know, of the number of falls somebody has, or it could be that you're looking at their psychological and emotional well-being. So your goal might be to see a reduction in the level of anxiety or improvement in that person's mood. And most importantly, I guess for me, is to review and update care plans regularly. You know, look at your risk assessment, review them whenever there's any significant change. Discuss things with the family as well, because obviously they know the person better than anyone. And recording daily records as well, you know, of how the person is interacting, how the person is responding to their environment, and the effectiveness of any strategies. So you might have some communication approaches in place, but also most importantly is any signs that any of the restrictions are affecting the person, making them maybe show signs of ill-being, for example. I guess the evaluation as well of whether the restrictions are still necessary, and whether there are any alternative strategies as well that could achieve the same goals but with fewer restrictions. I don't know how long I've been talking, but I think the final thing I probably should say is, after all that, is staff training and awareness is very sort of important. Helping staff to recognise and prioritise residents' rights can help create a culture that respects the residents. Also educating the caregivers, you know, the family members, that empowers them to help make informed decisions for their loved ones, and also to help them prioritise any restrictive options that, you know, be sort of minimised. So thank you for listening. I hope that made sense. I'll pass back to Toby.
That's great. Thank you, Caroline. Now, you brought up some really useful, important points there about recording and learning through reviews and evaluation. I think that's really, really important, and also involving family members as well. So some really helpful points. Thank you, Caroline. We're running slightly over time, but we've still got plenty of time for the interactive bit. So Rod Landman next from the Association of Real Change. England, and it's your 5 minutes, Rod. Over to you.
I'm having some straight. Yeah, are my slides showing okay?
Yes, they are.
Good, cool. Okay, so hi everyone. Yeah, so everyone else is more or less, as you say, managed to keep to time, which gives me a bit of a challenge, doesn't it? A little bit of background. ARC, as Toby said in the introduction, is an umbrella organisation for learning, disability and autism providers. Our USP is that we're the only national care association that's exclusively for learning, disability and autism providers. As for myself, my background is entirely in learning disability and autism services. When I left school many decades ago, I went to work for the National Autistic Society in the town where I grew up. And I've stayed in learning disability and autism services ever since in a variety of roles, organisations and capacities. I'm working for ARC for an alarmingly long time now. And I do a variety of things for ARC. Probably the two main things are I deliver on quite a lot of disparate training for ARC, including the suite we have of MCA and DoLS courses, which I'll allude to in a moment. But I also do an awful lot of project work for ARC, and most recently over the last few years that's involved projects which have seen me increasingly working again directly with people with learning disabilities on various aspects of criminality as they affect people with learning disabilities. And I've run projects that have been, say, increasingly co-produced on issues like mate crime, sexual exploitation, social media grooming for the purposes of extremism and radicalisation. And most recently, I've been supporting a team of women with learning disabilities and autistic women, all of whom have experienced domestic abuse or sexual violence or both. And they've been supported to draw on those experiences to devise and deliver packages of learning. And all of that project work kind of draws into and draws together with the training that I do on mental capacity and DoLS, because some of that activity has posed serious challenges. One of the things that we know about domestic abuse and learning disability, for example, is that it's 3 times more likely to happen to you if you've got a learning disability, and that people are likely to stay in more dangerous relationships for longer. So that poses all sorts of challenges in terms of deprivations of liberty and restrictions, and people appearing to consent to very dangerous situations or very dangerous relationships. So the 3 things that I wanted to touch on, we were all given the brief of kind of touching on 2 or 3 key points that we wanted to make, and my first one really is just to echo what Lorraine said right at the beginning. I was glad, Lorraine, that you started with the maximising capacity, the second key principle of the Mental Capacity Act, as being quite possibly the most important one. All of these essentially I see as kind of tools for avoiding deprivations of liberty, ensuring that deprivations are a last possible resort. And I think if you drew a Venn diagram for certainly these first 3 bullet points, you'd find a substantial amount of overlap between the 3. But as far as we're concerned in ARC, we think the 3 key weapons you have in your arsenal are maximising capacity, genuine application of the second key principle of the Mental Capacity Act, making sure you conduct a really good capacity assessment that is not about the paperwork, but is about your relationship with the individual, and about co-producing risk enablement. So really sitting down with the individual, looking at their life from their perspective and trying to draw on their solutions. So very briefly, a quick case study for you. We do all of our training using a series of case studies, and this is one of the ones that we use. It's a very basic case study, and yet very typical, and gives rise to sort of most of the issues that I think we'll be looking at for the rest of the afternoon. This is the deal. He's 25 years old. He lives in your residential care service for the sake of argument. He has a learning disability. He's been unwell. He's been to the doctors. The doctors told him he's got diabetes. He's been given there an accessible leaflet about his condition. He's met the diabetes nurse specialist, and he's assured her and everybody else that he understands what's going on, perfectly happy to manage his condition by himself. But when he gets home, the first thing he does is he goes into the kitchen to sort himself out a cup of tea. And when you go through, you see him ladling his usual 5 spoonfuls of sugar into his tea. So there's a whole bunch of issues there, and I say, well, it's a very basic one. I think that the issues that it gives rise to and the resolutions to those issues are fairly universal to far more intractable cases, such as the ones I was talking about in relation to domestic abuse and sexual violence, for example. So our suggestion would be the things that you really need to do with the deal, first of all, is to sit down and have a conversation with him. make sure he really understands what's going on, give him tailored information that meet his communication preferences, whatever they might be. Let's find out what we know about a deal, similar decisions that he's made in the past. How do they come into play? How does he learn? How does he respond to issues which cause him stress, for example? And again, thinking in terms of those communication preferences, the basic stuff, right person, right place, right time. Are we talking to him in a way that maximizes his opportunities of communicating what he needs? So having a conversation with the deal, putting him in charge as much as possible. I said earlier on about co-producing risk enablement. Let's think about his perspectives to the situation, his solutions. His solutions, after all, the ones that are most likely to be followed. And again, what control can we give him in terms of researching the issues himself? What can he find out about diabetes? What the possible alternatives are? Are there support groups that you might be able to join? And say sitting down and doing joint risk enablement processes with a deal. And then finally, I would say, just draw attention to good assessments. And as I said right at the beginning, good assessments, really good assessments, and not about the paperwork. They are about demonstrating your thinking, demonstrating your working, showing your working, telling a story about what you've done with the individual. And there's no substitute for patience and empathy. That's what it's about. It's about building that relationship with the individual, building a relationship of trust that you can build on, and say minimizing the need for deprivations of liberty to our greatest possible extent. Just to close, as I said earlier on, we do a whole suite of training. And when you get the PowerPoint from today, these are sort of click-throughs, these are hyperlinked to. We do training for frontline care staff. We do trainer sessions for facilitating those one-day training sessions with frontline care staff. We also have a more discussion-based workshop for managers. All of those are available. Sorry, it's a slightly fragrant bit of a sales pitch here. And in person, all available in person or online. We can do them frequently do now. I would say most of the training that we have now is more geared towards in-house and bespoke options. So, drop us a line, let's have a conversation about that. And they are discussion based. They're absolutely not chalk and talk. They're absolutely not just sitting and listening. They're really interactive workshops, as I said earlier on, based on a series of case studies, hugely discussion based. And all those bits of training we offer as a full day or as 2 half days. And they are driven by values. They're both risk and rights affirmative in all cases. And here are my contact details. And I think that's me done, Toby. I've got no idea how I was doing in terms of the timing because I can't see the clock on my screen.
That's fine, Rod. I think you managed to keep it to 5 minutes. So thank you, and got your sales pitch in as well. But really lovely to have an example, a case study. I don't really like the term because people are people, not cases, but to hear about a person. So thank you for that. So could I ask all our panelists now to toggle themselves so they're back on screen, and I'll go over to Liz to ask Liz if there's any questions that have come up whilst the panelists have been speaking. If not, I'd invite people to submit questions, but we can go to some of the questions that have been posed in advance. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you. And thank you, panel. Very useful to have all those different perspectives, really helpful. So we have got some questions in the chat, and I think some more are coming in. So I'm going to take a bit of a prerogative here because I think it was when I was listening to Lorraine, actually, the concept of fluctuating capacity occurred to me, and then Lois put something in a little bit further on in the chat about fluctuating capacity. So my question was just about some wisdom, really, from the panel on how best to consider ways to avoid a deprivation of liberty for people with fluctuating capacity. And then Lois sort of builds on that by saying if a person's capacity does fluctuate, can a good crisis support plan done with the person help? And she references including physical intervention like restraint that's mainly aimed at self-harm and suicide. So we've got some questions really around fluctuating capacity and how we help and support people.
So who would like to come in
well,
on fluctuating capacity? Go on, Lorraine. I can see
Shall I
you.
start and then I can do the easy bit and other people can join in? I think it depends on a number of things. So how fluctuating is a person's capacity? So, for example, capacity can be where a person lacks capacity for decision making. It has capacity for decision making in the morning. As the day goes on, particularly with dementia and other types of illness, may not have capacity. I think with those types of very, you know, up and down within a day type situation, you are really looking at them not having capacity for decision making more than they've got it. So you have your overall arching plan in place, which probably will still amount to a DoL, but I'll come back to the other type in a minute. But the most important thing really to remember is that a DoLS authorisation is permissive. It's not an order. So if at a particular point in time you do not need to impose some restrictions because the person is absolutely fine, then you don't impose them just because you have a DoLS in place. I mean, seeing this more and more really misunderstanding, oh, they can't go out because they've got a DoLS. Well, do you now think they're safe to go out? If they're safe to go out, they can go out. The DoLS is permission to restrict where it's needed. Another type of fluctuating capacity is where you look over a very long period of time and a person may actually be very, very well, have capacity for long periods, and there are just certain spikes of, let's say, dysregulated behaviour based on very specific things. Sometimes with that kind of situation, you can say, well, actually, this is a very short, intense, little period of restriction and restraint. That will fit under the MCA. We need to restrain them. It's MCA section 5 and 6 because it's maybe, you know, once now every blue moon that this happens. So I think those two periods are different. How fluctuating is it? Obviously erring on the side of caution again, but yeah, for some people certainly where there are very few and far between where there are times that need intense restriction and restraint can sometimes fit just under the MCA. So I hope that helps.
Great, thanks, Lorraine. Does anybody else want to come in on fluctuating capacity in relation to possible deprivations of liberty? I think it sounds like you covered everything. Well done, Lorraine.
Sorry, I was on mute there, Toby. Sorry.
Yeah. I was just going to ask Rod if he might have something. I thought he might have something, particularly on the restraint point.
Well, on certain fluctuating capacity, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd agree first of all with Lorraine, which I think the kind of genuinely fluctuating or genuinely problematic fluctuating capacity is actually restricted to fairly few people, because most fluctuations are either short term or predictable. And I think that suggests a certain way of approaching things, but we do kind of give more advice that's more specific, I think, to those more intractable problems, where it's not temporary, not predictable. And what we always say to people is it's about working with the individual when they do actually have capacity, in those periods where they do have capacity. So how much can you agree with the individual in advance? Particularly helpful, of course, if the person actually has insight into their own conditions, and can give you strong advice about what they would want to happen at the times when they do lack capacity. Good practice also talks about running almost like a holding pattern, so sort of taking the minimum action necessary. So not doing anything irreversible, not doing anything serious, in the hope that the person will regain capacity at some point and again take control of their own lives. And I think there's also something there about in the background about working on again on enhancing capacity. Again, you got to go back to the application of the second key principle of the Mental Capacity Act. What can we do to ensure that people have capacity for longer periods and that their capacity is enhanced at those times when they do have capacity? And then I think I would go back to stuff that we were saying earlier on in some of the introductions about making sure that you record everything, that you keep everything under review, stay up to date. And I would also just suggest you're taking legal advice as well, because when it comes to those more complicated issues around fluctuating capacity, that may well be an area in which you need to take legal advice.
Great, thanks, Rod. Neil, you wanted to come in here, yeah? Go ahead.
Just a little point, really. But I think care plans and support plans should include a sort of scaling of restrictions. So when somebody is fluctuating, that there is a sort of pathway that staff can follow, because otherwise they're in the dark, really having to make decisions in the moment. So I think it's helpful for professionals to have a plan, and it would be even more helpful if that plan involved the person, what Rod was saying, getting their position on it if they've got the insights, and that can be helpful, I think, just for everybody concerned. So I just wanted to throw that one in.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I'm going to come in with a couple of questions that have been sent in advance, if that's okay, Liz, because people have taken time to do that. One's a very quick one and one's probably a bigger one. So I just really wanted to ask this of Lorraine, actually, because one of the questions was, is there a summarised or user-friendly document outlining the key points for care homes as well as community settings? And I was wondering whether the LGA guidance that you put up, does that cover community settings? I know DoLS, deprivations of liberty occur in community settings, but DoLS are less frequent, but just wonder whether the guidance would be helpful there.
I think the guidance helpful across all settings, but in terms of sort of simple materials, obviously we all stopped doing things because we thought LPS was on the horizon. So certainly around there are two things that I'm not promoting my own material. It's just that these are the only two I'm aware of, really. I did two simple guides, a guide to DoLS and a guide to community DoLS for families, just one page things some years ago for ADAS that are still on their website. I can try and find the link. Way back in time, Department of Health, as they were then, did some simple materials around DoLS, which are still okay, but obviously they're only okay if you can get your hands on them, because things are in very short supply. The Law Society Guide to What is a Deprivation, we've put the link on there, but that's not a quick, it's fantastic. It's not a quick read. So actually, I think in terms of community settings, there's very little, but I will send Toby the link to the two sort of one-page things that I did, if that's any use.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Lorraine. We suddenly seem to have lost one of our panelists. I think Caroline's fallen off the call, but hopefully she'll rejoin us. The other question I just wanted to come in, if you don't mind, Liz, was just a question that someone had posed in advance. Is about the role of CCTV and other AI tools. It came up in the first webinar, and just wondered what people's thoughts were, the panelists' thoughts were about, can it be used to prevent a deprivation of liberty? What are your views about CCTV and other technical monitoring? Go ahead, Liz. Go on.
Well, just to say, Toby, in the chat, Kate has asked a question which is similar, which is, does placing movement center in a person's room so that we can check when they're up and about to minimise risk of falls, does that require referral to DoLS? So the digital and tech potential is, incredibly valuable in some ways, but we're just trying to obviously providers are trying to navigate making sure that they are on the right side of things when they're using that.
Does anybody want to come in here?
I'm going first, so I can just say the easy bit, and then everybody else can deal with the rest. I think that CCTV, AI, technology, everything that's out there, they're all fantastic. Movement sensors, all of the rest, it's sometimes better than having a person. I can think of lots of cases that I've been involved in DoLS as a best interest assessor and a DoLS lead and so on. There's nothing worse to me than somebody coming and checking on you actually in your room. Movement sensor may do the same job. Lots of these things are fantastic, but they do go towards this cumulative effect of restriction, adding up the numbers of restrictions. So, you know, if you are being observed by a movement sensor or by CCTV or another form of technology, unless you're able to consent to those things, of course, then we're into different territory. But where you can't consent, these things must still be seen as part of the restrictions. If there was only a movement sensor in a person's room and absolutely nothing else, I think that's unlikely to meet the requirement of complete and continuous supervision and control, but it's unlikely to be just that one thing. So it's about having that awareness of all those small restrictions that alone might say Section 5, Section 6 of the MCA. Maybe it's a restraint because it restricts a person's liberty of movement, but does it deprive them of liberty? Not necessarily, unless it goes hand in hand with a whole load of other things.
Does it restrict their movement? No. If it's a sensor technology to see if you've fallen over.
Yeah,
I mean is that not an enabler?
Yeah, I mean, it can still be restraint and be enabling. The old point of DoLS is that a gilded cage is still a cage. No matter how beautiful and wonderful, a gilded cage is still a cage. So it can be enabling. It can be much better. I use technology a lot. My daughter had a brain injury in 2010. She has quite an intense care package from personal assistance, but we use technology in the place of people. So she's not got people in her life. Technology supports her to appear to be independent. I talk about that as invisible scaffolding, but it's still playing that part in having some kind of control, because it doesn't happen to me. You probably don't have a movement sensor in your room, so somebody else is listening and having an eye on what you're doing. Anyway, I'll stop because it's one of my things.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's great. Thanks, Lorraine. Neil, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Yes, yeah. I've worked with several people that have lots of telecare, as it's called, lots of different things, including sort of video footage and stuff, which, you know, it's a camera that's on all of the time, if you know what I mean, so that somebody can be monitored. And I think it, you know, if the person can have some insight and some view on it themselves, they will have an opinion. And those opinions are very important. That's why in nearly every case, these decisions are made under the person's best interests as a best interest decision. And that involves the best interest checklist under the Mental Capacity Act, and all relevant people are involved. And it's usually the social workers, the care providers, the family, the person themselves, an advocate. And the end result is a decision that's hopefully the right one, that's going to help provide safety and security for that person. But the cost of that is that, you know, what civil liberties are being eroded here, and what other freedoms and things. And people have opinions, and some people we work with perhaps will have some different opinions about this, and maybe paranoid ones around, you know, how harmful it might be to them. So we've got to bear in mind their views. It's really critical. Otherwise, you know, we've got people that have this stuff installed and won't use it, or will avoid it, or put it away, or unplug it and things, and it won't be any use. So it's really important to consider the person. And if that person needs some reassurance, then that's all it would take for this to be useful equipment. Then that's what's required. And sometimes it's not considered. So things can fail when they're put into place. So just to make this, if it's going to work, you know, it needs to be properly thought through. The person needs to be involved as much as they possibly can. And if there are any questions that person has, to try to answer them, because otherwise you can have the best kit in the world. And every year technology gets better and better. You know, where's it going to lead to? I do not know, but I'm sure, you know, it'll be fantastic. But we'll still have the age-old problem of people and their own opinions about what this stuff is and what it is to them. So I just wanted to put that in there, you know, before we rush in and kit everybody up with the latest gear. Will they use it? Will they interfere with it, sabotage it? These are the problems that we see. So I'm just letting you know.
No, absolutely. It's all designed to try and find ways of supporting people better. But, you know, that's absolutely essential, isn't it,
Yeah.
Neil?
Rod, did you want to come in?
Yeah,
quickly
I
before we
did.
move
I
on
did
here?
want to give it a positive spin because I think you're absolutely right. All of those concerns, absolutely, they've been expressed extremely well there. But I think there are also, we've seen a couple of cases, for example, with people with epilepsy. And yeah, that sort of sensory technology that you're talking about, Liz, you know, if it makes a difference between somebody with epilepsy being able to go out in an unrestricted way and not, then obviously that's a good thing. And we all agree on that. And I think when you get AI as well, which is kind of our route into this, and I think, you know, as a society, we tend to have the new technology was always regarded as something kind of rather fearful and terrifying, and for very good reasons, actually, when it comes to AI, I think in particular. But it also offers fantastic opportunities as well. And I've been doing a lot of work on online harms and learning disability and autism over the last year, 2 years. And I would argue that not only are all of the online harms that we can think of for ourselves exaggerated when it comes to supported people, but actually so all the benefits are as well. And I think it's always important to remember that the internet is a fantastic place for most people to be most of the time. And when it comes to things like AI, so you're regarding it sort of typically as a threat, I think it offers fantastic opportunities for people with learning disabilities and autistic people around things like communication, organization of their lives, staying safe. I think, you know, sort of being able to things, you know, programs that can detect a scam, for example. We know that people with learning disabilities and autistic people are hugely susceptible to online scams. And we suspect there are technological solutions to these sort of technological problems. So stuff around staying safe, around employment, around people having independence and control. And again, without wanting to do the massive sales pitch here, Toby, we have just set up a series of 3 workshops that we're going to run with supported people. So they're directed at people with learning disabilities and autistic people about the advantages of AI. And that they're going to be free to attend, and that series of workshops starts in December as a way of kind of counterbalancing the kind of the threat narrative that is so much built up around it.
Do you want to put the link up in the chat?
I was going to say, do you
I
want
can
to
do
share
that.
that?
It's hugely restricted in terms of. Can I? Is it something that I can send you afterwards?
Yeah, send it.
You're now assuming that I know anything about technology, and I don't. So that's something we'll send on afterwards.
So
Liz,
I've got. Sorry, I've got.
With that, Caroline's sort of coming going. I hope Caroline is able to be with us. So I wonder whether there's any questions in the chat, some of the regarding older people, but also maybe the role of advocates. I don't want to put you on the spot, Michelle, but I don't also want to deny you the opportunity to contribute as well. So I just wonder whether there's anything in the chat, in the questions that have come up on those.
Well, there's a question. There's a couple of questions about assessments, so I think we'll come to those because there's some nuts and bolts questions which I think we can answer quite quickly. But Kate has said, we have residents who are diagnosed with dementia and short-term memory problems, but they understand they can't manage independently and they don't ask to leave. But if they did want to, they would be at very high risk. We have a coded door and they can't just go. Should we refer them for DoLS?
Lorraine's giving a thumbs up.
Yeah. Best in, let me just look at Trevor. Done movement sense.
Whilst you're looking, Liz,
I think that's probably it. Then I think we need to go back to assessments and nuts and bolts. So perhaps we should actually talk about door locks and codes and stuff.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted
Sorry, there's a question about power of attorney, which I've just answered, but I don't know if it's just worth reading it out because it's quite a quick one, which is about the weight. How much weight does the opinion of a power of attorney for health and welfare Matt, I think how much weight is given to the power of attorney. So I've just written the answer to that, but because of that, it's quite straightforward, really. If a person with power of attorney or a deputy, as it would be, objects to a DoL, then the DoLS technically can't go ahead because it does of the no refusals assessment. So there might be various ways of solving that, but just to answer that question, there really is a lot of weight to the person who holds authority in that situation. So just thought it was a straightforward answer, really.
Thanks,
So,
Ray.
sorry.
Caroline and Michelle, I just wonder whether the questions that I sent through that we'd received in advance, whether you had any ones that you particularly caught your eye that we haven't yet answered. And I don't know whether, Caroline, you're able to come in there. And I was interested in the first question, which says, even though a nursing resident, let's assume nursing home resident, is not asking to leave and doesn't want to get out of bed or their room, is a DoLS still necessary? We have completed one, but wanting clarification. And I've read that and reread it, and surely there shouldn't be a DoLS, should there? Michelle, do you want to come in here?
So I think it would come around to capacity assessment first of all, because because the person's under nursing care or is in a care home, we can't just assume they lack capacity or they have capacity. So that we make the presumption they do until it's proved otherwise. If the person lacks capacity around their care, support, accommodation needs, and that decision has been made for them, then a DoLS would make sense, because whether they're objecting or not, they're still being restricted, if you like. I'd say yes.
I suppose the question doesn't really say enough about what the continuous control and supervision looks like, does it? So it's difficult to answer in that respect.
I think just on the basis of they can't leave, they don't try to leave, and they couldn't leave if they wanted, is irrelevant. None of the three people in the Cheshire West case, none of them ever tried to leave. So it's not about attempting to leave or being able to leave. It's would you be allowed to leave? Just on the free to leave question. But I agree with Michelle.
Okay, thank you. Neil, did you want to come in with a comment there as well?
Well, it's just going to say what Lorraine said, but we work with quite a few people who are bedbound under adults in a care home or nursing home. And yes, we provide them with a safeguard, as an independent person going in as a paid relative person's representative. The DoLS provides a positive thing for them, so that there's independent scrutiny, there's the support to be listened to, and to enable that person to be able to speak up if there are things they're not happy with or whatever. It's their last chance to have an independent, because we're involved as advocates when there aren't really relatives available or best friends who can step in. So normally those people would have that support, but they could have that support from a relative who has agreed to become a relative person's representative. And that's a really important role for the care, the relative, the family member, or even best friend, where they can do a bit more and have a bit more power to get things sorted if things aren't right. So it's a good thing in some ways, the DoLS itself. It's the deprivation which is the bad thing, but the whole DoLS itself is a safeguard. It's a provision to help that person to have the best deal that they can possibly have. And their representatives are there to fight for that for them.
Yeah.
So I just wanted that to be said, really.
Yeah. And I think, thanks, Neil. And I think, as someone pointed out in the first webinar, that sometimes deprivation of liberty can be really helpful for a person. It can secure them the best possible care in their best interests, even though it does, obviously, it's more than a restriction. So it's not that a deprivation of liberty, although it's a violation of human rights, when it's necessary, it may ensure that person is safe, providing it's in their best interest and meets the other criteria. So, but as you say, it's so important to have that external scrutiny, independent scrutiny that you just talked about, Neil, and it's focused on the individual and the individual's needs. Liz, were any more questions coming up in the Q&A that you mentioned about door locks and things?
I think we've done that.
Okay.
No. So a couple of questions about assessments. So Jenny asks, how often should mental capacity assessments be reviewed? And then Lauren says she's been listening and there's a clear emphasis on the need for good assessments. Have we got any really good best practice resources we can do that? So we're in the assessment space. How often should we review them, and can you point us to some resources for best practice on doing really good assessments?
Got a feeling Lorraine's gonna.
I was going to say, it sounds like a Lorraine question.
I'll do it again. I would hate to say how often a mental capacity assessment should be reviewed, because some of the things that I really hate about the Mental Capacity Act is that we've kind of got on a bit of a treadmill. You must do a capacity assessment, you must do a best interest. Well, why are we doing a capacity assessment? There's no reason to doubt, and so on. And I think you are always keeping a person's mental capacity under review in your mind. So I don't mean that every day you're going out and picking up a piece of paper and reviewing it. But when you are dealing with the people that you support day in, day out, you have that knowledge of something is better here, something has improved, something has changed. And if you're practicing supported decision making, you're aiming to move a person towards that independence and autonomy. So I think you're always mentally keeping it under review, which might sound like a cop-out. And then I think it depends what the decision is. You know, if it's capacity for managing medication, has anything changed? If it has, you'd review it. If it's capacity for something sort of pretty huge and one-off, may not need looking at again. Though those smaller everyday decisions, I think it's an organic thing. I just don't like the idea that there's ever a capacity assessment, you failed it and you've fallen off a cliff edge and that's it for you forever. It should never, ever be the case. So that I'm not going to say anything about resources. There are lots and lots of them out there.
Great. Thanks, Lorraine. Michelle, do you want to come in here?
I was just going to sort of make the point from the IMCA perspective. We get referrals in, around DoLS, but also we get referrals for long-term accommodation and medical treatment. And it's just remembering that capacity, again, is decision specific. So we've got to remember that, you know, just because somebody lacks capacity for one thing, we have to look at assessing their capacity for the specific decision as well.
Yeah, very
so that
important.
can be obviously, you know, could be changeable depending whether the person has fluctuating capacity, which we've discussed previously. So I think, as Lorraine said, it's not as easy as to say like do it every year or do it every month, because it changes all the time.
Yeah, no, thanks, Michelle. And as has been pointed out several times, about knowing the person and knowing, perhaps understanding them, and knowing that perhaps they won't have capacity for a period of time around specific questions, specific decisions, but then things can change. The fluctuations may be in a way that you can be aware of them and know them and know how to respond. Yeah, Rod, you want to come in on this, and then Neil, and I guess then we need to think about winding up. But over to you, Rod.
Yeah, it's a very, very quick point, again, in relation to what you were saying about knowing the person, really, to underline something I said earlier on in my bit, which is when it comes to resources. I'm sorry, I've got a cough sweet I'm sucking off. When it comes to resources, I'm frequently asked, can you just give us a model form for us to fill in? And say, just to underline what I said during my bit earlier on, it's not about the form, it's not about the paperwork. Don't just buy a model form that you can fill in. It's not about the form, it's about the relationship with the individual and putting in that time and having patience and empathy.
Great, thank you, Rod. And Neil.
Yeah, just a very, very quick one. I know it's decision specific and it's also time specific, but it's also the fact that we've seen several cases, or people rather, that have had their capacity overturned by reassessment. So it's not a totally perfect science. And I think Lorraine was mentioning that, really. It's very rough and ready still. So be cautious. That's what I will say. And if you're concerned, you know, a review might be the best thing for that person if they've been deemed to lack capacity and you're not sure. But the other caution of that is to over-assess somebody is quite a horrific situation. And, you know, also people can, through that process, falsely gain capacity because they know what answers to give. So just to be cautious, there are cautions around this area.
Good point. Thank you, Neil. Thanks for that. Yeah, Michelle, did you want to make another point? Go on.
I was just going to give an example, really,
Right.
from what Neil said there about sort of the answers to questions in assessments. So I've worked with a client, it's a few years ago now, and in a care home from hospital, had several capacity assessments that, you know, the DoLS wasn't granted, then the DoLS was granted, and this person would answer questions around where he was living and about the care and support he received, but along the lines of, I'm in prison, I'm, you know, they don't look after me, the prison guards, he would go as far as to say, you know, it's like being in a Nazi war camp, and that was the responses to questions. But so after getting to know him quite well and sort of building up that relationship, you realize that actually, you know, because people said, well, he's confused, he's not given the appropriate answers, and actually he was just really frustrated about the situation he was in, and that's how he viewed his situation. And he knew that wasn't right, and he knew that the answers he was given weren't the answers that people wanted to hear. And he would say to me, you know, I'm doing it for the response, I'm doing it because that's what it feels like. So, you know, we requested that the capacity was reassessed, and he did have capacity, and he returned home as soon as the report came back. And again, it was just about, you know, getting to know the person and finding out about them and building up that trust and relationship, really, because so on the surface he lacked capacity and couldn't answer the questions, but when you dug a little deeper, he could.
Yeah. Getting to know the person, very important. Thanks, Michelle. Liz, there were a couple more questions that sent in advance, and I just wonder whether I could do them possibly quite quickly. One of them was about asking how to record effectively, progress mapping and effectiveness of strategies and outcomes. And I don't know whether Caroline's with us, but whether she's able to speak. But I think that possibly goes back to the points that Caroline was making about good care planning, good recording, reviewing what happens, and that about the individual, not just collectively, but reviewing the situations develop and whether or not the person has capacity or resumes capacity, whether it's in their best interests, and evaluating the effectiveness. I suppose I don't know whether anybody of the panel members have any views about how you can other ways of effectively monitoring progress or reviewing beyond not just doing the annual review and leaving it at that kind of thing. But I think you said, Lorraine, about having it in your head, really, and it's knowing the person and knowing what the signs are of someone perhaps regaining capacity or the deprivation or restriction no longer being necessary. You're nodding, yeah.
I agree. There's no sort of substitute really for that kind of really person-centered care planning. You know, even down as a BIA, sometimes people will say to you, oh, she's always asking to leave, and you go, okay, well, when did she last ask to leave? Oh, well, actually there's not a single record, you know, anywhere in the notes. So where do you go with that as the professional trying to decide, does this person really object and keep saying they want to leave? You know, so there's no substitute for just things that are particularly, you know, you wouldn't record for every resident, never asked to leave, you know, but where you feel somebody is, then it's that evidence is really useful, and it's person-centered, you know.
Yeah. Thanks, Lorraine. Was there anything else from the Q&A, Liz, that in the last minute or two we could cover? There was a question that came up in advance about the role of community organisations such as churches in playing and supporting individuals, which I don't know whether anybody had any thoughts about that. And I can see how it's gone, Lorraine.
The one thing that I would say is we've heard talk about relevant persons representative from the advocacy people that are here. Certainly in Shropshire, we looked at a different way of doing that when I worked there, and we had a volunteer scheme for what's called the relevant persons representative. So this is the person who's going to visit somebody when there's a DoLS authorisation in place. They're going to kind of just get the feel that everything's okay, but they're also there if the person says, you know, I want to challenge this, I want to get out. And we found that to be a really, really useful use of volunteers, because you got a wide range of different people. Absolutely no disrespect to the IMCAs, but we only had one in Shropshire, so that was the one person you got when we used to use them. Whereas using volunteers was, you know, a really nice wide way of doing that. And I know a number of other places do use volunteers in that way. So that's the only thing I can think of in relation to DoLS where actually community groups or individuals could get involved.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Lorraine. That's a nice example. I'm guessing we need to finish now, really. So I hope we've been able to cover most of the questions that people have posted during the session and questions posted in advance. Caroline, just checking whether you can hear us or you wanted to say anything, but you've been kind of obviously having difficulties with connectivity. I can't hear you speak, so I'm sorry that that's disappeared altogether. So I'm sorry that Caroline had difficulties there. I think we will finish now because we're due to finish at 3:30.
Just to say, Toby, I think there's a couple of questions from the chat and probably from the ones submitted that we might want to think about for our final session, which is just the reality of the fact that the system is massively delayed, and you know, people are still living their lives in settings, and you know, I guess the paperwork is a long way behind the reality, and the process is very bogged down. So I guess we probably need to think a little bit about some words of wisdom for folks on our next webinar. This one's been really about finding ways to potentially avoid a DoL, but there is the reality of the world that we're living in. So perhaps we might need to think a little bit about that in our next and final discussion.
Yeah. Thanks, Liz. I think we had a question in advance about how to manage delays. So that segues nicely into reminding all of you who've come today that the next webinar is at 2 o'clock until 3:30 on Thursday, the 5th of December. And everything that you've heard today will be great, there's information about it, so will be up on the Care Provider Alliance website, so the presentations and the discussion that have taken place today, so you can revisit it, as well as obviously the links and so on. And we will be sending out a very brief feedback form, which would be really grateful if you could complete that. It will come to your email within a couple of minutes of the webinar today finishing. So if you could give us a bit of feedback, that will be really, really welcome. I'm sorry if we haven't been able to answer everybody's question, but we have got through a lot of questions. So I really want to thank our panelists, as I see them on the screen, Rod, Neil, Michelle and Lorraine and Caroline, although she obviously had difficulties connecting. Really appreciate your expertise and your experience and sharing that today. For those of you who've attended the webinar coming on in December, Rod and Neil and Michelle will also be there. We'll have another expert, independent social worker, Annie Ho, who will be talking about the DoLS processes, authorisations and reviews and so on. So please do come if you can. Is there anything you wanted to say, Liz, just before we finish up?
Oh, just a massive thank you to our panelists and to our participants, and for all your engagement and questions. Thank you. Great to see you.
Yes, and I'll second those thanks, and thanks also to everybody who's supported the webinar from the Care Provider Alliance and the National Care Forum. So on that note, we'll stop there. It's 3:30. I wish you a very enjoyable rest of the day and hope to see you, or hope you are able to attend on the 5th of December. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye. Cheers and bye.